Hey everyone, welcome to another bonus episode of Crime Family. I'm Katie and I'm here with AJ. Steph is MIA, but that's all right. So, just me and AJ, and I am going to just get right into this case. At first, it kind of seems like an open and shut case until you kind of hear a little bit more of the full story. And then you just kind of think, like, how did this happen? So, I'm just going to jump right in. So, I'm going to be talking about the Thomas James case. So, are you familiar with this case at all?
I mean, the name sounds kind of familiar, but it's probably from something else and not from this. So, yeah, I haven't.
Maybe it'll jog your memory once I get into it, but I didn't hear of it either until very recently. And it's an older case as well. So on January 17th, 1990, two men entered an apartment in the Coconut Grove area of Miami, Florida, with the intent to rob the residents. So inside the apartment was Francis and Ethra McKinnon. They were an older couple living on disability payments, and Ethra's daughter Dorothy and Dorothy's husband Johnny. So when the two men entered, one of them was masked and the other one was not, and they order all three of them on the ground at gunpoint. And Francis was upstairs when all of this happened. And so he's the older man that lived in the apartment. And he grabbed his gun and he went to see what the commotion was. When the intruders see Francis, one of them fired their gun at him and they shot him in the face. Francis dropped immediately to the ground and dies from that gunshot wound. Now, the two men that are robbing the apartment, they grabbed less than $1,000 in cash and they ran out of the apartment. So there was multiple eyewitnesses who saw the men running from the area, and they were able to identify the men as people that were known to the area. One of them went by the nickname Dog, and his real name was Vincent Cephas Williams, and the other was a man named Thomas James. Police have the names, they look through their files, and they find Thomas's mugshot, and they see that he had prior arrests for drug and weapons possessions, and so they take his picture, they add it to a picture lineup with five other black males that are completely unrelated to the case, and they did the same thing to Vincent's photo. And then they return to the eyewitnesses with the photos, and one witness named Regina, she identifies Vincent but not Thomas. And she clarified that she never actually saw Thomas. She says that she just heard that Thomas James was one of the men that they were looking for, and that's what she told police. But apparently, the police still put her down as an eyewitness to seeing both men. And some of the other eyewitnesses claim that they even know Thomas's mother, Mary. And so he was kind of known to the area and known to some of the people that lived around and in Coconut Grove. When the detective showed the lineup to eight eyewitnesses, two of them pointed out to Thomas, while the others couldn't identify anyone or they chose a different picture and not Thomas's. So, a little bit about Thomas James. At this time, he was only 23 years old. And although he did have drug and illegal gun possession charges, according to Tristram Corton reporting for GQ, Thomas was aspiring to turn his life around. He was saving his money and he was trying to start his own small business, a car wash, just like his father had. And then he wanted to get into real estate. So he did have other dreams that did not revolve around this illegal life that he was kind of getting himself into. So now we are 6 months after the murders in Coconut Grove. And Thomas has been in jail for about 3 weeks on these other charges, so the drug and gun possession charges, and he's waiting for his hearing. And at the time of his arrest, he had given the police an alias when they arrested him, but they, of course, uncovered his real name to be Thomas James. But, giving the police an alias definitely is not a good look. It makes it seem like he did have something to hide for sure. So, not looking particularly good for Thomas at this point. So, when he's actually brought into court for what he thinks are just the drug and gun possession charges, the judge tells him that there's actually a warrant out for Thomas James for first-degree murder. Now, Thomas claims that he's shocked. He had no idea what they were referring to. He was adamant that he had not committed any murder and that he had not even been in the Coconut Grove area in years. And so when he was first accused, he was shocked and confused, but he just figured that they had the wrong file and maybe they just made a mistake for this hearing. So he wasn't too worried at first, but he eventually did find out that no, it was his name on the file. He was being charged with first degree murder. It wasn't actually a mistake. And he found out that there had been people that had identified him by name as being at the crime scene. And some people had pointed him out in a photo lineup. And so this is where, kind of his confusion turns into him being scared that something actually more serious might be going down. Like he's thinking that these murder charges might actually stick. So Thomas's lawyer at the time, he wanted to present an alibi for Thomas, of course, for the time of the murder, but Thomas couldn't provide one for that particular day. So the murder was committed in January, and at this time when all of this was taking place, it was actually August. So 6 months later, and Thomas claimed that he couldn't remember what he was doing or what he had done, where he had gone on that seemingly random day in January. So he wasn't able to present an alibi for that day, which, could kind of go both ways. It's like, well, you don't have an alibi. It could have been him, but also he doesn't remember what he was doing because it wasn't significant. So it's kind of like, oh, you can kind of see both sides. During the trial, one of the eyewitnesses called to the stand was a bin collector or like a garbage collector who was out on the street that night. And he claimed that one of the men who committed the robbery asked him for a cigarette. And when he was asked in court if he saw the man in the courtroom that day, he said no. So he wasn't able to identify Thomas in the courtroom. Some argued, though, that he wasn't a reliable witness because he had cognitive impairments, and so they just thought he wasn't able to be a reliable witness. So Dorothy, who was one of the women in the apartment that night, she, however, did identify Thomas. She was a nurse and she was used to having to make detailed observations, and so she was thought to be a very credible witness. And then the other testimony in the trial was the detective who showed the photo lineup to the other witnesses, and he stated that he did get positive IDs on Thomas. So there's kind of mixed reviews here about some people being able to identify him as the man at the scene who committed the murder, and some are saying that they can't identify him. So, kind of a mixed bag. There was also 9 fingerprints that were taken from the scene that night, and none of them matched Thomas. And so all of that I just, said in the last 2 minutes, that was basically all the evidence that there was for and against Thomas. So yeah, like there's no physical evidence. There's some people that are able to point the finger at him, some people that even called him by name when they were talking to police, and then others not being able to identify him in a photo lineup. So, I mean, what are your thoughts so far? Like, which way would you be leaning at this point if you had to make a decision?
That's a hard one. When you say, bring up the fact that there was no physical evidence of his at the scene or any evidence that ties him to the scene, I find that that's hard to refute, but also that doesn't mean just the lack of fingerprints doesn't always mean that you're innocent. I mean, maybe he wore gloves that no one else did. I mean, you said there was 9 different fingerprints or something, so that's weird. Also, the fact that some people could point the finger to him and others couldn't. Like, I don't know. I don't think I'd be leaning one way or the other. It seems very kind of up in the air to me. If I had to make a decision, I would probably say no, but that would just be like a forced answer. I can't really say. It wouldn't be beyond a reasonable doubt either way.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking. If I was on that jury, it would definitely not enough evidence to be like, yeah, for sure it was him. Because it does seem like there's so little evidence for both sides that you can't really pick a side. Either way, the trial didn't last for very long. It was only a 2.5-day trial because, I mean, how could it be longer? I'm surprised they went that long. They had like 2 seconds worth of evidence. I'm sure maybe there was more. They just haven't released it. But the jury did find Thomas James guilty of first degree murder. And the death penalty was actually considered, but because one person was concerned about the weak evidence against Thomas, he was given life in prison instead with parole eligibility after 25 years. So the fact that that weak evidence comes up enough for him not to get the death penalty, but that's not enough for him, not to be convicted at all is a little bit weird. Because for me, it'd be like, "Oh, I'm not really sure." So I'd be like, "Maybe don't convict him," but that's not what happened here. He was still convicted. So Thomas goes to prison, and he actually got more answers from his time in jail than he did from lawyers and the justice system. So, of course, he's still saying that he's innocent, wrongfully convicted. About a year into his sentence, Thomas was chatting with another inmate in the prison yard, and this inmate said that he knew that Thomas didn't commit the murder in Coconut Grove, but he said he knew the man who did commit the murder, and his name was Thomas James, but it was a different Thomas James. So somehow, if that's true, there's like a horrible case of mistaken identity just because they have the same name and they live in relatively the same area. They both had prior criminal records, but for some reason, the other Thomas James just wasn't on the radar at this particular time when the police were looking for Thomas James. So it's kinda crazy because I mean, if you look at pictures of both of them side by side, both Thomas Jameses, they don't look alike at all. They're both black men, and they're maybe going bald, but that's about it. You couldn't mistake one for the other very easily. So, it's just kinda crazy that it got as far as it did with this mistaken identity.
That's crazy.
Yeah, yeah, I know.
I was like, "What are the chances?" Like, the same name?
How unlucky. Yeah, yeah, Thomas James, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like a super uncommon name, I guess, but
It's super unlucky for them to both kind of live in the same area and for people that were involved in this case to know a Thomas James and think it was him. Like, that's just a coincidence is crazy. Super unfortunate. So Thomas actually starts looking into the case himself because now he actually has something to go on for his own defense. And it actually takes a couple of years for him to even gain access to the case files. And when he does, he finds out some stuff that should have brought police to the same conclusion that they had the wrong man. And at the very least, like his lawyer should have done something with this info. He finds out when the police were talking to people about knowing his mother, they kept calling his mother Mary. So they say, I know Thomas's mother. Her name is Mary, but Thomas's own mother was named Doris. And so, that didn't stand out to anybody that they have the names wrong here. And so there's Mary versus Doris. There's a disconnect here, but nobody picked up on that. One of the victims in the apartment that night of the murder, she claimed that she's even related to Thomas James and his family. So Thomas's grandmother was Ethra's sister-in-law. So Ethra was the wife of Francis who was murdered. So not the man that was convicted. She's related to the other Thomas James, but somehow there's still a bit of confusion here where she didn't even realize that they're talking about the wrong Thomas James. So that, went undetected.
so basically no one knows what's going on.
Yeah, they just hear the name Thomas James and everyone just is like, yeah, that's who it was. And just not connecting the dots here. Like wrong mother's names. It's like, yeah, I'm related to them, but still not, realizing what's happening. So Thomas asks one of the staff at the prison if she can look into the system for another Thomas James. And sure enough, there was a Thomas James who lived just 3 miles from Coconut Grove. And his mother's name, surprise, surprise, was Mary. And so this Thomas James is actually serving a life sentence as well for armed robberies. So, I mean, at least he wasn't out living his life while the wrong Thomas James was in prison. But still, this man was serving a life sentence for a crime that he didn't commit. So it's not a good situation. So Thomas had made several appeals before he knew all of this other information, but they had all been denied. And even when he presented this new information, his appeal was still denied because all of this information was supplied to his lawyer who did nothing with it. So it technically wasn't new information and there was no basis for an appeal. So it's kind of crazy that his lawyer kind of knew the discrepancies but didn't do anything about it. So either like incompetence or just really does not care at all about this case. So he also found out that there was actually 3 children in the apartment that day who were not related to any of the adults present in the apartment on the day of the murder. So there was actually 7 people, not 4 in the apartment as testified in court. So that was another, like, mistake or just, outright lie that was presented. And so James started gathering inmate statements from people who knew Vincent, or Dog, the other guy that was allegedly there during this robbery when the murder happened. And of course, several inmates knew him and they knew that Vincent had bragged about that night and how they had shot someone who had tried to be a hero that night and that someone else had gone to jail for the murder. So Thomas's family, even outside the prison, tried to help out. They got one of the children who was at that apartment that day, so she was now 33 years old. They got her to sign a written statement saying that she basically would never forget the face of the man who was there that night, and Thomas James, the one charged for the crime, was not that man. And so he filed another appeal with all these statements. He contacted media outlets for help, but still nothing was successful. And so James finally he reaches out to the other Thomas James, who goes by the name Tommy. So I'll just call him Tommy, not to get confused. So Tommy admits that he knew the cops were looking for him for that murder, and he knew, of course, that they had arrested the wrong Thomas James. But he also claims that he wasn't the one who committed the murder either. So he was innocent of the murder. He probably, didn't want to come forward and say anything because then he would be charged with the murder. So when this murder actually happened, he was in jail at the time, so he couldn't have done it. And if police, kind of would have looked a little bit deeper into that, they would have known that. So they were actually looking for this Thomas James the whole time, of course, who was in jail. And then they happened to stumble upon the other Thomas James and just kind of took him down, thinking it was this guy. He did know the family of the people that they robbed and murdered. He knew the house is what people called a numbers house. And this is, I guess, the Cuban Numbers was a gambling enterprise in Miami. And Francis McKinnon, the guy who was murdered, he was rumored to be a so-called numbers man who collected money for bets. So people knew that. They knew that there'd be a lot of cash stored in his house because he did this illegal gambling kind of thing. And it's speculated that those kids that were at the house that day were the kids of some of the gamblers who had sent them to go pick up their winnings rather than doing it themselves and implicating themselves in this illegal gambling ring. So, just a kind of a whole sketchy group of people. Anyway, people knew all about this. And so Tommy was actually related to the family. He had been in that apartment before. He had actually been planning the robbery and talking about it, scoping out the place. And he figured that people saw him, kind of heard what he was up to. And so at the time of the crime, when it actually happened, they just figured that it was him because he had been talking about it previously. And so people that identified Thomas James must not have actually seen him because it wasn't him. I guess he just planned it with Vincent and then he went to jail. So then Vincent just did it with somebody else and everybody just assumed it was Thomas James. So, I mean, this whole circumstance is just like perfect storm for this other poor Thomas James. So by the time Tommy got out of jail for whatever he was in jail from before, Thomas was already convicted of this murder. And Vincent told Tommy to keep his mouth shut. So instead of setting the record straight, he just didn't do anything. And Vincent was actually never found by police. As far as I know, he's never been brought to justice for this crime. So he got away. And they don't know who was with him that day. That person is still out there. They had another suspect, I guess, but he recently died. So they're really not sure who even the real person was. So no one has actually been put to justice for this murder. Thomas's family hired another lawyer. She dug into this case and tracked people down. She got more statements and information, and then finally, not that long ago, April 26th, 2022, Thomas Raynard James was released from prison after 32 years. So it's crazy that he went to jail for this crime. He's completely innocent, even though people speculate that because he kind of was a known drug dealer, convicted, drug gun guy, that the police just kind of saw that and like zoned in on him, as we've seen in other cases. They're just very much, this is our guy, let's get him. And the kind of the circumstances surrounding that, like people telling them exactly who they thought it was, didn't help his situation either. And also, so I guess typically in Florida, if someone is wrongfully convicted, they are entitled to $50,000 compensation for every year that they spend behind bars, to a maximum of 2 million. So Thomas should have been entitled to 1.6 million when he got out, but because he had a prior felony conviction, he's not eligible for any money under the state's clean hands provision.
Oh my god.
So I mean, yeah, after all that, because of that felony, he's not getting anything from them. So
That's so annoying.
yeah, it really is. But I mean, still, don't have a felony, maybe?
I guess. But also too, it's like it's just annoying. It's like, okay, under this law you can get compensation, but we're gonna make sure that there's other laws so that you can't really get like makes it harder for you to get it. It's just annoying.
Yeah, I know. If there was a loophole.
It's like either just give it or don't give it. Like why do this whole rigmarole?
Yeah, I know. Yeah, it sucks that he doesn't get anything, like any compensation. Or maybe he will from some other kind of outlet, but
But also, I mean, like even if he has a felony, it's like it's not a felony for what he went to jail for. So he's still in jail for 32 years for something he didn't do. So it shouldn't matter if you have a felony. It's unrelated to why he was in jail for 32 years.
yeah, exactly. And he probably would not have been in jail for as long as he was for that other felony, right? So he was definitely there longer than he should have been. So, yeah, that kind of wraps up this case. And so, like I said at the beginning, it did seem like it was open and shut. He did it. But then there's all these little things that came in. It's kind of like, how did that happen? Like, what a crazy set of circumstances for that to go down for this poor guy who finally did get out, though.
It's crazy like how those set of circumstances happen. It's like almost sounds so unreal that it like if that were to happen in like a movie plot, you would say that's so unrealistic because that would never happen in real life. But it does. I mean, it did.
Yeah, it did. Yeah, it's kind of crazy. So, yeah, that's the story of the mistaken identity of Thomas James. So, hope you enjoyed our bonus episode, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye.